In previous videos, we talked about the philosophy which evolved in ancient Israel, and how they began to see history as an unfolding narrative. And if we are able to recognize the crucial turning points of this narrative, then we can properly order ourselves to bring about paradise. We talked about the philosophy of Socrates and Plato, and how they saw self-transcendence and overcoming our own self-destructive behavior as the ultimate goal of humanity. We saw Aristotle's theory of potential and how he believed everything around us was acting on purpose, trying to reach its fullest actuality and trying to come to completion. And because humans are doing the same, we fit in and belong to the world around us. We looked at St. Augustine and St. Paul, who merged this Greek thought with the Christian worldview, and came to the conclusion that the reason the world is acting on purpose is because of this grand narrative, which is trying to resolve inner conflict and help us gain inner peace. We looked at how this idea of fitting in with reality began to be undermined around the 14th century, how Copernicus and his development of the heliocentric model of the solar system caused many people to feel that their natural sense of reality could no longer be trusted. And finally, we discussed how Galileo's discovery of inertial motion caused them to feel adrift in a meaningless universe that is no longer acting on purpose, but acts simply because things smash into each other mindlessly. One individual comes along who truly exemplifies the chaos and anxiety of his time. Martin Luther latches on to this idea of inner conflict introduced by Paul and Augustine, and he feels this is an embodiment of what is going on in the world around him. In Luther's view, our will is obsessed with itself in an immoral fashion, which is cutting us off from God and trapping us in self-deceptive and self-destructive patterns. He then unites this inner conflict with the mystic's idea that we can only know God through self-negation, and he brings these two ideas together in a very profound form of self-loathing. Luther concludes that the will of the ego is so strong it can't negate itself. This is a problem because our will must be negated for us to properly love others and love God. Luther then picks up on Augustine's claim that we cannot save ourselves. What Augustine meant is that we must be drawn upwards towards self-transcendence by love. Luther does not believe this can happen. He believes we must be saved by something external to us, but it can't be brought about by anything we do, because that would be an act of will. And our will is precisely what is blocking our salvation. We must completely give ourselves over in blind faith to what is saving us. Faith was once seen as understanding the crucial turning points of history to bring about a better world. But now the sense that we are participating in the unfolding process of our own cultural history is lost, and faith is reduced to the simple acceptance of a proposition, which cannot in any way be based on evidence or arguments, because that would be our mind participating in our own salvation. What this means is that self-transcendence is erased. Any impulse towards self-transcendence is evil because that is an act of will, and your will blocks the will of God. What Luther is trying to do is rescue us from the fact that we are self-obsessed, which is a deep source of our suffering. The irony is that he makes this problem worse. We can only be saved by an arbitrary act of God. When we think about this, it becomes clear that we are being saved for no reason. No part of our character or the way we have lived our life is the reason we are saved. If there's nothing we can do to earn our salvation, this means the entirety of our worth is external to us. This is a cultural training for narcissism. Narcissism is when we feel we don't have an internal value, so we constantly seek that value in the attention of others. We are saying, please look at me, because only your act of looking at me will prove that I matter. This cultural framework is pushing people to constantly seek unearned attention. We are trying to compensate from the outside what we do not possess on the inside, and nothing can be done to overcome this because self-transcendence has been erased. This is the Protestant Reformation, which rises out of Martin Luther's response to the profound corruption within the church. To bypass this corruption, Luther is saying the only thing that matters is the individual's relationship to God. Everything else is will, pride, and attempts to earn your salvation, which is all an illusion. He is attacking the tradition of the church, and he is telling us that traditions and institutions don't matter. In the West, there were two institutions that were tightly linked. The university is where we would practice reason and science to gain knowledge. This was paired with the monastery, A place where we would go through the spiritual practices to bring about this self-transcendence and help us cultivate wisdom. Institutions for knowledge and wisdom were tightly linked because in this worldview, spirituality and rationality were tightly linked. Together, they are supposed to represent an important synthesis of how each of us can make our lives deeply and profoundly meaningful. But if self-transcendence is an illusion, then spiritual practices are a useless and deceptive activity. Wherever the Protestant Reformation spreads, the monasteries and the whole idea that we can ascend to God is shut down. If you ask someone where to go if you want to acquire knowledge, they would likely say the university. But where do we go to cultivate wisdom? Institutions of wisdom have rapidly faded, and there are very few cultural traditions left for us to latch onto. Perhaps you can see the dilemma Luther has presented us with. He is telling us that our individual conscience is the ultimate authority in our connection to the divine. But he is also saying our egocentric framing of reality is the one thing blocking our salvation. He's placing this massive load of responsibility onto the individual while simultaneously telling us we do not have the capacity to carry that load. This has become a huge source of our existential dread. The mathematician, physicist, and inventor Pascal perfectly summed up the feeling of his time when he said, "Those infinite spaces terrify me." The cosmos was once seen as a place built for us, and a place we are acting in unison with. Now the cosmos is this massive, crippling, and terrifying thing. Catholicism and Protestantism are so opposed to each other that they're going to go through hundreds of years of civil war trying to destroy each other. This radically undermines the Christian worldview. God is increasingly becoming this bizarre and absurd thing, and he is going to rapidly disappear from the world. Martin Luther began the Protestant Reformation in 1517. And less than 100 years later, God is absent from the greatest literary figure in English history. Shakespeare is filled with supernatural elements like witches and ghosts, but no God. Notice how radically disconnected people are in Shakespeare's world. Macbeth is this powerful figure who asserts his will and it ends in disaster. Hamlet can't stop reasoning and questioning while everyone is dying around him. He can't follow through with any action because he is incapable of asserting his will. Asserting our will is disastrous, and failing to assert our will is equally disastrous. Shakespeare was able to pin down a very immediate problem. No matter how we orient ourselves in the world, things end in chaos and disaster. We can't trust our senses, we can't trust the church, and we can't really trust ourselves. Our wisdom institutions are disappearing. We have this cultural framework pushing us towards anxiety and narcissism. All of those rich connections with reality have been withdrawn, and it is starting to sound like how many people feel in modern times. If you haven't seen parts 1 through 9 of this series, I hope you guys check those out, and I hope you join us next week when we move on to Hobbes and Descartes.